And so can I just pick up on that and then go to,
Please.
then, because I do want to respond to your
Yeah.
question. It is a very stimulating and challenging question, and I have a definitive answer to it.
Oh, let me just summarize the last sentence is, thus, Imago
Thus.
shifts the locus of healing, the wounds in
Right.
From within.
your individual history and your
Mm-hmm.
past, or my past, my present. We don't try to doctor the wounding of the individual. We invite couples to step into doctoring the between and making the between
Yeah.
safe
That's an important.
and healthy.
That's an
And
important
it
additional
shifts the locus of healing.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that shift of the locus of healing was not conceptual, it was experiential. That what we saw was that couples don't get well inside. They change their relationship and they change their context, their ecosystem changes. The toxicity of negativity is regulated if not removed. It's regulated down and if not removed. And so they live in an ecosystem which we would call the space between or betweenness. Like, I love the cherub thing that God is going to reveal himself between the cherubs. One couldn't do it with one cherub. You have to have this polarity.
Right.
That's an interesting thing. There's a lot of stuff in quantum physics about that as well. You have to have this polarity, or just an ordinary electricity. If you don't have the polarity, you don't have any energy. The AC/DC, Anyway, so the
That's cool.
Right.
AC/DC.
AC/DC.
Yeah.
Thank you. So it's interesting that when Helen and I met, and in the first hours of our conversation, she posited that I sounded like Martin Buber. And I retorted with, sort of like hell you say, I don't even like the man.
There's nothing about Buber.
He's almost unreadable. Plus, what is this thing about between, the space between? Because I was at that time psychodynamically oriented, and it was the Freudian self that we all wanted: autonomous, independent, self-sufficiency. That was the therapeutic goal. And I didn't know at that time that therapeutic goal was in fact therapists helping people become pathological. And it's really interesting that 100 years of psychotherapy has basically been helping people get sick. Because or live in an illusion, if you could call it a sick illusion, because you can't be autonomous.
Right.
Unless you're dead, and I don't even know if there's any autonomy there. And independence is certainly not a part of it, and self-sufficiency, clearly not possible, and so forth. So all of that language was a misleading language, and I think one of the reasons why psychotherapy has had such a bad success rate,
Right.
over like maybe 45 to 50%. And now we know that success rate was because of the quality of the relationship between the therapist and the client.
Right.
It had nothing to do with the theory. And that the research is that most theories are useless except those theories that are internally consistent. And that those are helpful, but eclectic theories are not useful because that turns the client into an object which you're treating rather than a person with whom you're relating in that integrated system. So it's interesting that Helen saw in the first hours of our conversation this hyphen. We didn't call it that then. It was like Buber, that the hyphen, and that the thou-ness of the other was what transcended the itness of the other. And little did we know at that time that we were beginning a conversation that would lead ultimately to otherness. That is, if you want a great marriage, you have to get it that you live with another person. And that person is not anywhere near the fiction of your imagination. In fact, the opposite. And that's what's going to make you mad, it's what's going to create conflict, and you're going to fight with them, and so forth. So we are now on a project that is really fascinating. We've arrived at I still want to respond to your question about woundology, but we've arrived, but you're setting this up. Is that okay if I go ahead with ZN? Mm-hmm. We've arrived at a conclusion, which is that, and the conclusion is that the outcome of the therapeutic system, the intellectual system of Imago, is zero negativity. And the outcome of a successful therapy is that couple's relationship would be essentially free of negativity. Zero negativity would be the goal, even if they hadn't achieved it, but that would be the intention, and eventually they would do that. And that started with mine and Helen's recovery of our own relationship, which at the time we thought was just an interesting exercise, and we would talk to people about it. But we've discovered that that was a second kind of thing, that that our relationship transcended and became what we would now consider optimal, a dream, ideal, because of the zero negativity. So we now think of zero negativity as that's the human dream. That's the dream of every spiritual tradition, is to help people live in zero negativity. You know, inner peace, surrender, attachment. And Jesus said, you know, judge not that you be not judged. That's just the human dream, and that zero negativity is therefore the kingdom. That's where all good things happen after negativity ends. And so zero negativity is actually the beginning of the experience of the unique self, of whatever good life there is happens when you, because negativity is a negation. That's what negativity means. It negates you. Even if I just say, that's not right, that's a negation, instead of I see it differently, which is an affirmation, that we are two people looking at the world like God, looking at the world through different eyes. So I just wanted to elaborate on how profound this insight was that you brought to the conversation in 1977, when we first started having our arguments. And Harry Stack Sullivan, you also thought was, would be useful to me. And I thought, Sullivan is a schizophrenic. And that's, he said, whatever happens inside people is irrelevant. What happens between people is the only thing that's important. And I thought, yeah, how could he say that? It's what goes on inside. So this gets back to woundology.
Yeah, good.
And I'm want to say two things about that. One is we have decreased our emphasis on the importance of the wound, in the sense that we discovered at the clinical level that if you focus on the wound, you increase it.
Right.
And we thought in the analytics tradition that if you focused on the wound, you would dump the energy and decrease it. But what we found is if you focus on it, it increases. We didn't know why. Helen and I stopped that work before the brain sciences came online, in which we now know that what the brain science is helping us understand is when you focus on something, you irritate or amplify or stimulate that neural network. And if you focus on remembering traumatic childhood experiences, you will find more and more traumatic childhood experiences, but you actually don't. You just increase the intensity of the ones you've discovered, so it feels like more. So we knew that was not a therapeutic direction. So we will want to go there in order to understand our present, but not go there in order to repair our present.
Right.
Because what you actually do is make our present more wounded.
Key distinction.
But I don't want to throw out the word wound. I want to throw out the emphasis on the wound.
Right.
Because I think that Helen and I have come to we've come to this thing, that what we want to talk about is not original wholeness. In some sense, the unique self would be original wholeness in the sense of uniqueness, in which the focus is still on the self, on the person. Mm-hmm. We want to talk about original connection. And that original connection is what we get here with. And as an infant, we now have 5 grandchildren. I've just seen it happen now 5 times. They are ecstatic in the relationship with their mother and in the relationship with us. Mm-hmm. And they are not ecstatic if there's any rupture in that relationship. Mm-hmm. And then the conclusion, what led us to the conclusion was we saw a video, 2.5 minutes, that you know about, the still face experiment that was done at Harvard by
Ed
Tronick.
Right.
In which the baby and the mother are in a static relationship. The mother's mirroring the baby and the baby's mirroring the mother, and then the mother turns away and turns back with a still face, and the baby goes into a temporary trauma and begins to try to get that mother to start. So what happened, we see there, is the rupture of original connection. That it had very little to do with the mother or the baby. It had to do with the connection between them. And when that connection was ruptured, the baby then went into itself and became defensive, trying to get the mother, using the central nervous system.
Yeah, autonomically dysregulated.
Yes, right. And so it did sympathetic advance, and that didn't work. It did parasympathetic response, went up and then down, and none of that worked. And then the mother smiled and said, "Oh, here I am." And now the baby, the original connection has been restored.
Right.
And I've talked to Ed about this. He would not let those experiments go longer than 2.5 minutes because he wasn't sure that this might not become a permanent memory. So therefore, that the experiment itself might have some damaging effect on the child. But the repair is so quick that he is reassuring himself, and I feel a little reassured by that, that if the repair is quick, and no, with Helen, if we get ruptured, if we repair quickly, then we're fine. But if we let it go on, then it takes days to get over what we didn't repair quickly. So I think we talk about this as original connection, and when that original connection is ruptured, that's what we would call the wound. It's not any particular thing like mommy hit me, or that's a connectional rupture. So everything that happens in childhood is a connectional rupture, and that's what we call a wound. And when that wound happens, all of the problematics of the human situation for us arises. And it shows up in couples, but it's the human condition, which is, I now am anxious. And at the moment I become anxious, I also activate my deepest desire. We are not creatures of desire until we've lost connection. Because connection is our essence. That's what we are. We are connected. We are connection. We're not connected. We are connection. At least that's our language about that. It's not something you do or can undo. It's what you are. And so when the mother turns away, the baby loses its sense of felt connection. And when the mother turns back, the baby has the experience of felt connection. And now things are fine. But if that doesn't happen quickly, and it doesn't for most human beings forever on the planet, for all the millions of years, that's the human problem. You go into anxiety, and anxiety triggers desire. The desire is for connection, and you'll take substitutes, drugs, alcohol, sexuality, do whatever you can. You'll kill to try to get connected, and so forth. And that desire then leads to what we think is the experience of symbiosis. And that symbiosis is the merger of everybody's consciousness. Then you think everybody's looking through your eyes. And it's a great shock to discover they're not looking through. They're looking through their eyes. And so that leads to a loss of empathy. When you go into symbiosis, a loss of empathy. And that's the great human tragedy, is now the connectional possibility doesn't exist. And then when you go into that, then you go into objectification. And objectification is what the human species lives in. You're an object. You're the Boberian it. And if you're in it, then I can do anything to you that I need to do in order to get my needs met. One thing I won't do with you is connect with you. Now, if I connect with you, then I have to put you back up into the thou position, which is equal with me, and therefore that's a terrifying space. Until you regulate that with zero negativity, and then you're living now in original connection all the time. But if a negativity shows up, that ruptures the connection, that creates the anxiety, so that then you have the human condition, and the human repair is restoring original connection. So I think that it may be the same thing as original self, but we don't talk about the unique self in the self in any sense, except as the polarity of the space between. So it's original connection instead of original wholeness. And we're slowly having to erase the word recovery original wholeness out of our language, because every time you put that word in, now you're merging paradigms, which is the paradigm of the individual versus the paradigm of relationship. So I think that's as a response to what you ask.
Yeah,
And
no,
it'll be a longer discussion.
Yeah, I want to kind of get back to both of those, but let me hear. It sounds like you got something about to emerge here. Are you?
Huh?
What
Could
you
you feel
thinking?
it?
I can feel it
You
coming.
feel emergence?
I can feel the word.
Emergence.
I can feel the word.
No, it's such a rich conversation in that exactly the baby becomes dysregulated because the attunement, which
Yes.
now
Right.
attunement they're realizing is the affect, second by second, millisecond by millisecond, that's transacted between the caregiver and the baby.
Yeah.
And right when there's just a rupture of it briefly, the child looks regressed. It's just, it is floundering. And I think that's so crucial because it does frame things somewhat differently in that, well, let me throw in the attachment literature just to complicate things even more.
Yeah.
So, basically in the original attachment literature, without going into a lot of detail, they did the strange situation, which all of us read about in Psych 101, except it was hard to really understand what they meant in Psych 101. But it was the experiment where the baby was in the room and a person with the experiment came in, and then the mother left for a period of time, a brief period of time, and then the mother returned. And what I didn't get in Psych 101 was that where it delineated the child's attachment classification was in the response at the reunion with the mother. It wasn't about the stranger being in the room, it wasn't any of the rest of it. And so the idea in the attachment literature is, of course, that fear activates that need to connect in the attachment network, and that it's actually relationship that's like the natural anxiolytic, if you will, that calms and soothes. And so the children develop based on what goes on with the caregiver in the environment, a particular strategy, not that they're aware, I'm strategizing, of how to maintain connection. Because if you're a primate and you can't maintain connection historically, your likelihood of being eaten by a saber-toothed tiger is much higher. So it's just in us at that level to attach, because attachment is life, and to remain unattached is death. So then there are basically in the original work 4 strategies. Well, basically, and the first is the securely attached child, and how they behave on reunion is they go to the parent and they relax completely in the mother's arms, and they're able to be comforted, and if they're crying, it's easily resolved, and there's connection. The mother goes to the child goes to the mother, and then there's comfort. You could see the relaxation, and then the child goes back to play. And then there's the avoidantly attached child, who, upon the mother re-entering the room, it's like she'd never re-entered the room. It's like she's about the same as the stranger in terms of how the child relates. But it's so interesting that the heart rate of the child goes up when the mother leaves the room, and it never goes back down even when she re-enters, which tells you something's going on below the surface there.
Right.
And then the preoccupied goes to the mother, but it doesn't allow full embrace. The child doesn't allow itself to relax in her arms, or can't relax in her arms fully, and doesn't settle. So it keeps on emitting like sounds and things that show that it's not calm. The child does not become calm. And then there's the disorganized, which different people have called it AC, which is both the avoidant and the preoccupied combined. So
Can't decide which one.
yeah, the disorganized child just doesn't settle on a particular strategy, because it's like, what do I need to do? And for some reason, maybe there's a discontinuity in the relationship with the caregiver that doesn't allow the child to know what would make it safe.
Yeah.
So interesting what you say in so many different reasons then, because a lot of people, like the avoidance, grow up to think that relationship, well, they don't think it's not important, but they downplay its significance. You know, they're the people that might be thought of as looking sort of pathologically autonomous.
Yes.
And they come into treatment, for example, and say, well, we've got 30 days and give me all the stuff and let me go through the list and let me do it perfectly, piece by piece, and
It's
I
a
don't
problem
intend to
solver.
connect with anyone here, so don't get too close to me, just give me all the stuff.
Yes.
And it's like, that's not really going to work, actually. You can't actually heal in isolation, which is not happy news. And then there's the preoccupied who maybe is so concerned with finding the right person, the exact person who will somehow redeem them and heal them and provide everything that wasn't provided originally. And of course, that doesn't work either, because in receiving love, you name why it doesn't work. It's like a flow-through tea bag. It doesn't really hold. So the other person, they can accidentally pick just the right person who actually is able to fill them with all kinds of wondrous things and reflect them to themselves at the deepest level. They can't really take it in or absorb it.
Right.
And so then that gets back to what you were saying, which is when you're talking about how people say that specialness will interfere with your evolution. You have to give up the notion of specialness in order to be at one. It's like when people come in and they feel egotistically special, it's probably because they truly didn't feel held in their true specialness. Not because it was anyone's fault and not because everyone might not have been doing the absolute best they could, but just for whatever reason. Nobody escapes childhood unscathed, whether it's in the home or it's in the culture, it's in the school, wherever it is. Nobody escapes without taking on shame rather than accurate reflection. And shame makes us all objects. And then an object, as you say, can treat another object anyway.
Yeah.
And so objects have sex with other objects, and objects rely on substances to numb them so that they don't have to feel human.
Right.
And eating disorder clients come in and say, I wish I could just take a pill because I don't want to feel anything. I don't want to feel the food inside me. I don't want to have to eat. I don't want to be human. It's like, wow, you want to be a machine. I saw that in the Matrix movies. But to whatever extent a person feels objectified, whether it's a positive objectification, like, I love you so much, you're my most prized possession, or whether, you're an abhorrent object and get out of my sight. To whatever degree the person is objectified, they lose their humanity and they lose their sense of true specialness. So then they cling to false specialness, like, I make the most money, I have the most degrees, I work the hardest, I do this. And every relationship is just everlasting competition, which I think you all speak of really well in your book. So they're holding on to specialness like, a log in a sea of disconnection. It's the thing they have. And then exactly, they do have to yield that up and realize, no, they really are part of things. They really are a part of everything. They really are not separate. And God, his or herself, did not fail to note their existence. It's just there might have been a very narrow conduit through which the love of the universe could reach them once upon a time, or maybe it narrowed due to experiences.
Yeah, great.
But then when a person really expands into the awareness of their true specialness, which is the hope of relationship, that another person can actually reflect to yourself, your non-objectified, human, beautiful, intricate, fragile, unduplicatable self, then it's the liberation everyone wants, but that everyone's afraid to, I think, allow themselves to move towards, because what if there's no such thing and they need to hold on to that log?
Right. No, that's great. That's great. And bring the attachment conversation into the conversation is key to the conversation. And that's one of the kind of huge advances. And it's a key part of the story. So maybe make one distinction and then kind of go back to this, kind of bring this all back to the kind of the meta conversation about this kind of core connectedness. The core, because I think that's really the meat, if you will. All you vegans, I apologize, but the core of the conversation. I spent last night with John Mackey, who's Mr. Vegan from Whole Foods, so I kind of can't say the meat of anything.
This is the smoothie.
The smoothie, thank you.
Yes.
That's awesome. This is John, this is the smoothie of the conversation. That's great. So let me just make a distinction between a population that is at its core wounded in a way that produces psychosis, that produces radical eating disorder, etc. And you've spent most of your professional career just doing insanely awesome and gorgeous work together with Mark, your clinical co-director, not this Mark, the other Mark. More goes from Marks. It's a thing. I think your first boyfriend was Mark also. I think all three.
I'm glad everyone has that information now. So that's good. Yeah.
We'll be working
It's
with that later
important,
today.
Yeah.
Yeah. But you know, so that's a population which first off lives in all of us, because as R.D. Laing pointed out, the continuity. You know, we're all part of the. You know, it's all included in all of us, and yet I think we want to draw, you know, our kind of conclusions about what the ultimate vision is, right, from what I would call the, you know, the more or less, you know, kind of classical. I don't want to use the word normal because that word doesn't exist. You know, norm is the name of a guy who lives in Brooklyn. You know, there is no norm. You know, but kind of the kind of what we would call, you know, in big quotation marks, the healthy population, right? You know, the child who had, you know, good enough parenting. You know, harking back to Winnicott. You know, who kind of gets it together, right? That's kind of our model, kind of for the conversation, because you can never use kind of psychosis, right, or kind of extreme, right, kind of dysfunction as your model, which was always been the problem, you know, in some sense, both in medicine, right, and psychiatry, right, is that the model of the human being, right, always came from, right, either the dysfunctional or the sick in medicine. And as we're kind of now realizing in medicine, we need to kind of develop a new medical, a new psychiatric model, which comes from, you know, this place of connectivity and wholeness.
The population I've dealt with actually the longest are couples in marital or sex therapy. So I'm actually not talking about extremely pathological populations, because also most of the people I deal with who've been traumatized are not extremely pathological, just some horrible things have happened to them.
Right.
And many eating disorder clients come from kind of optimal families. That's not what's going on per se. It's just somewhere along the way, in everybody's life, there are places where objectification occurs to a greater or lesser degree.
Right.
It could be on the school playground. You know, you're treated as an object because you're different, or you don't have the right shoes, or somebody else on the playground's acting out something that happened to them elsewhere, and you get targeted. I mean, there are a million ways in which, and certainly it's true that if a person has a secure base, that mitigates the damage. But nobody arrives at an adult relationship without carrying with them some of the shame they've taken on and the lack of awareness of their wondrousness. So whatever population it is, it's just a matter of degree, I think, rather than.
That was.
Is that your point?
I think. I mean, that's my reference to R.D. Laing. I mean, actually, it's always just a matter of degree.
Yeah.
Right?
Exactly. I mean, we're them and they're us.
Right.
I don't see much division.
That's what I meant when I said they're inter-included.
Right.
That we're all inter-included. R.D. Laing
makes sense.
Completely agree. And, you know, with that, and then we'll bracket this. Just so we don't get kind of lost in that rabbit hole. But you know, and so that was R.D. Laing. We're us. We're them. Inter-included, right? And we want to build our model in a way which includes, you know, we get to health, you know, by studying health, right? We get to wholeness by studying wholeness and seeing what does that look like, and that becomes the strange attractor to draw us into that conversation.
Absolutely.
So, is that good?
Yeah, I think neither is mutually exclusive of the other.
Good.
I mean, you have to know what you're moving towards, and then you pull out the weeds along the way, which are the things that are in the way, and then.
So let's start with the weeds. So what do we look at? You know, what do we look at when we talk about pulling out the weeds? I mean, which brings us back to the wound conversation, right? And kind of try and maybe sort of wrap that into kind of get into this hyphen. Kind of, I want to kind of get to that place.